and welcome to my first and most likely last YouTube video ever. As you probably figured out from the title, today I'm going to talk about a Japanese movie Himeyuri no To, or Tower of the Lillies from 1953. To begin with, I'm going to tell you some basic information about the movie, then I'll give you some historical background of the time period the movie takes place in. After, we will take a look at the movie itself, following with some further details about the director and legacy of the movie. So let's get to it, shall we? Himeyuri no To was directed by Imai Tadashi and produced by Toei Company. The screenplay was written by a female writer, Yoko Mizuki, who worked with Imai on more than one occasion. According to few sources, it was based on a novel written by Keiichiro Ishino, but I'm not really sold on this since the idea for the movie supposedly came before the novel was even published, so either someone time traveled or it was just a mistake. The movie takes place in 1945, before the end of the Second World War, during the Battle of Okinawa. It was an important moment in the Pacific War for both Japanese and Allied forces alike. Allies wanted and needed Okinawa for its close proximity to Japanese mainland, from where they could stage attacks and later planned invasion. Now, you may often hear that for Japan it was supposed to be some kind of decisive battle or turning point, just like every other island since Midway. But in reality, Japan was counting on eventually losing Okinawa. They had been preparing for it since 1944, and it was decided that 32nd Army under General Ushijima would fight a war of attrition. In other words, try to stall the enemy as long as possible in order to give the mainland time to prepare for final battle that eventually never came because, these guys. Battle of Okinawa is actually said to be one of the reasons they were deployed. The reason is, it was longer than they expected, very bloody, about 1/3 of Okinawan civilians and over 14,000 of American troops died, and the US expected that if they were to fight on the mainland, it would end up much worse for both sides. Most of the battle took place on the southern part of the island, where Japanese had built extensive defense lines around Shuri Castle, relying on natural landscape and using caves and tunnels as bases. This is also where the movie is taking place. For the battle, Japanese recruited not only Okinawan men for defense troops, but also local students over the age of 14 and their teachers to do supplementary work like carrying messages, transporting supplies, building bridges, or stepping as nurses. Boys were placed in Blood and Iron Corps or Signal Corps, while girls had several corpses depending on their school, like White Plum, Red Blossom, or Princess Lily Corps, also named Himeyuri Butai. As you can probably tell, Himeyuri Butai was the inspiration for the movie. The name Himeyuri comes from combining names of the school magazines published by Okinawa Female Normal School and Okinawa First Girls High School in Naha City. These were elite schools attended by girls from established families who were to become teachers. From 240 students and teachers recruited from these two schools, over 130 died in the battle. From now, I'm mostly gonna talk about them. However, the information partially applies to the other student corpses as well. When in 1944 the preparing for the battle began, the curriculum changed and the girl received basic medical training from military surgeons, being told they would be helping as nurses under the Red Cross flag. In March 1945, as the bombarding of Okinawa, often referred to as Storm or Typhoon of Steel, began, they were mobilized and transferred to Okinawa Army Field Hospital in Himeyuri town, where they served under direct command of the Japanese army. Himeyuri Field Hospital was definitely not designated with Red Cross. It was a complex of over 40 caves and tunnels, and from what I gathered, it should definitely not be labeled as a hospital as well. Although I would send there some COVID patients who thought it was all a hoax. Anyway, the conditions were horrible, resources were scarce, and the enemy was close. On April 1st, US troops first set foot on the Okinawan soil. Everything was going great for them for a few days. The Marines took the north almost immediately, and the army was making its way south without much resistance. Then, when the US troops reached the first defense lines on April 9th, the real fight began, and it was as deadly and horrible as fights can be. It was one of the bloodiest, if not the bloodiest battle of Pacific War. I'm not really going to talk about it. There is a lot of information available online on Battle of Okinawa, so if you want to know the details, just look it up. I'm going to give you only the necessary outline for the movie. Despite Japanese having the home base advantage, they were outnumbered, lacked skills, technology, and resources. Every time the US troops broke through their defense lines, they had to retreat to create new ones and save manpower to prolong the battle as much as possible. Meanwhile, the girls were treating to more and more wounded soldiers. They were occupied not just with medical work, like taking out maggots from the soldiers' wounds or helping during the surgeries, but they also had to make food for them, bring water, or bury the dead bodies. All the while, they were being bombarded from sky and sea and were lacking sleep and nourishment. Eventually, on May 25th, as US troops were closing in on Shuri, the hospital, along with HQ of Japanese army, had to be relocated south. The girls helped carry wounded and medical supplies through muddy roads. The most wounded immobile soldiers and two of the girls that were wounded during the bombarding had to be left behind in the caves with means to kill themselves before Americans could arrive. By the end of the May, the Shuri has fallen. This is a map from official site of Himeyuri Peace Museum, so credit to them. It nicely shows when was which defense line breached, where were Japanese and the girls stationed, and the way they retreated. So hopefully no one sues me for borrowing this map for a bit. As you can see, with few stops on the way, they retreated to the Kian Peninsula in southernmost part of Okinawa and set up a bunch of surgical caves, particularly in Itosu and Ihara. Syrians were kicked out by the army in the process, but who cares, right? No one gives an F about civilians when waging a war. At this point, Japanese had run out of medical supplies, so the girls were no longer giving medical treatment to the wounded, but they were still required to carry out tasks like bringing water, making food, carrying messages, and so on. This was going on for a while, but despite that, only 19 students have died while in the service. However, as the battle was reaching its end and Japanese soldiers had nowhere to retreat anymore, they were just a bunch of ducks sitting in the caves waiting to get hit. On June 17th, one of the surgical caves in Ihara was hit by American shell. On June 19th, another cave in Itosu was hit, and the girls received an order to disband on the same day. I don't know if I should tell that what followed was to be expected, but The girls and the teachers received an order to leave the caves and return home. Yeah. They were told not to surrender to the enemy or they would be raped and killed. Oh, and the disgrace. Because surviving the war in Imperial Japan is the worst thing you could do. They were also given a poison or hand grenades to kill themselves rather than get caught. This was also the time when most of the Himeyuri died. Since they were left out in the open without place to hide from the bombing, and they were caught in the crossfire of Japanese and American troops. The girls from the 3rd Surgical Unit in Ihara didn't even get a chance to leave before they were hit with an American bomb, and 40 of them died that day. Later in the field, some killed themselves along with the teachers, some got swept up by the sea, some jumped off the cliffs, some were shot, others just died of exhaustion or malnutrition. Only 104 students and teachers survived the war. On June 22nd, General Ushijima committed ritual suicide and organized resistance to the American troops ended. Despite that, the soldiers fought on because they were ordered to fight till their last breaths. Now let's take a look at the movie. The first production was supposed to happen in 1950, but since the Japan was under American occupation at the time, it got refused by the censors. Then, after the occupation ended, in 1952, it got picked up by Toei Company and Imai and was first shown to the public in 1953. Imai originally wanted to shoot on location in Okinawa, but since it was still under occupation, he had to resort to shooting in Chiba Prefecture instead. To make up for this, most of the scenes are taking place in the caves or the tunnels and on barren land destroyed by the bombing. So I'm not a filmmaking expert, but from what I've read, this handicap gives the movie a specific feeling of claustrophobia and tension. The short scenes replacing each other are supposed to create a feeling of confusion of the battlefield. Throughout the movie, there is not much of a battle shown, neither of the enemy. It is instead replaced by the sounds of explosions, the gunshots, and other sound effects, giving off the feeling that the enemy is behind the corner. The girls sing folk songs from time to time, even dance a little, probably to give us the feeling of their youthfulness. The plot revolves mainly around Fuehara Umi and her little sister, along with teachers Miyagi and Tamai. Despite that, it doesn't overshadow the other characters or the overall theme of the movie. Rather, it supports it and smoothly connects it. The movie begins on March 24th, 1945, the day the girls are mobilized to the Himeyuri Corps. Opening scenes are the archival footage made by US military during the battle, which give an instant feeling of being attacked. We get informed about the importance of Okinawa by the teachers while they are rushing to prepare for the inevitable battle as American aircrafts fly over their heads.
こうなったら絶対にここで守らなきゃ困るな。我々沖縄は多少犠牲になっても。ええ。犠牲なしに勝利は考えられないからね。
This is also when I first thought the movie is kind of nationalistic propaganda because of the talk about self-sacrifice, protect Okinawa, to protect mainland Japan, how victory can only be achieved through sacrifice, and blah blah blah. You know the drill. We are also introduced to the students as they come back from presumably digging trenches, and the civilians are getting ready to evacuate. They are preparing for the transfer to the hospital. The students are then given a pep talk about their patriotic duty. Personally, I give it an A+. Never been more motivated to stop watching and go to sleep, and then they hit the road. Few boom booms later, we see them crouching in the tunnels of the field hospital with not much light but a single candle. And since this is a Japanese movie, of course they break into a patriotic song. I heard it's for keeping up the spirits, but if someone expected me to sing in a dark wet tunnel with no personal space while we are being bombarded on a daily with no food and no chance to sleep, I would eat them for dinner. Then on March 29th, we get a first message from the front, of course saying Japanese troops have destroyed American ships and forced them to retreat without mentioning any losses on Japanese side. Now, keep in mind, this was like 1 or 2 days before the L day of Operation Iceberg. So, obviously, they weren't forced to retreat. In reality, they had already taken over Kerama Islands. These little fellas, and were sweeping waters for mines and other traps to clear the way to the beach. Okay, these false messages of hope appear throughout the movie few more times before they are labeled as such, expanding on the overall anti-war message of the movie. As a counterattack to Operation Iceberg, Japanese were planning their own Operation Tengoichi, during which they lost the battleship Yamato they prided so much. Before it was Operation Go Time, the graduation ceremony for some of the students was held in the barracks. Surprisingly, this actually happened and got named Sankaku after the shape of the rooftop. I appreciate how the movie have handled the issue of girls' first period on the battlefield nonetheless. The female teacher was the one handling the situation. It was so subtly suggested that male viewers could easily overlook it or misunderstand the scene, and it gently put the inconvenience of being a woman on the battlefield to the attention. According to the surviving Himeyuri, due to stress, some of them stopped menstruating for months, so I'm glad the topic was even brought up at all. Movie then jumps to April 29th, when Americans are already deep inland attacking Shuri defenses. We are greeted with shots of girls helping to treat the patients and information that they are already out of medical supplies and overcrowded. Kinda like hospitals for the past year, since some people don't seem to know what social distancing means. In a spell of like 10 minutes, we are shown all the suffering war causes, injuries, infections, mental disorders, malnourishment, and naturally death. Another month later, on May 25th, as US troops are closing in on Shuri, one of the most important scenes appears. While resting outside the caves, the teachers are having a chat about Japanese army suspecting Okinawans from being spies, discrimination, and the pain of separation from the loved ones. This is arguably the best scene of the entire movie, and because of that, I'm only gonna show you a part of it.
スパイはみんな沖縄人だって言ってますね。自分らの島だから自分らで守れ。俺たちはお前らの島を守りに来てやってるんだ。
This was also a commentary on the fact that despite Okinawa being official part of Japan for almost a century at that point, they were still treated as vassals rather than equals. It is followed by a symbolic scene when the girls put lily flowers on a grave of one of their Princess Lily sisters. I don't think this has much to do with reality. The tombstone is a nice piece of woodwork, which I doubt will be available during the battle, but as a means to show the girls' fate and the movie's war bad message, good enough. Before the relocation of the hospital to Makabe on the south, we are treated to some family drama when Fuehara, along with another one of the girls, gets buried with rubble after an air raid. Everyone jumps to action, since obviously they don't have anything better to do before the evacuation. MC has to survive, and someone else dies or gets injured for the tragedy instead. Meanwhile, heavily wounded soldiers and girls left behind in the tunnels receive grenades or poison to off themselves when the time comes. You know, the honorable death and all that nonsense. Our beloved merry band of future victims of war then wanders from bunker to bunker, battling with terrible weather, exhaustion, hunger, and pain. Some of the girls take shelter in civilians' houses, where they are treated with kindness. We are reminded of the special bond between teachers and their students few times. Even sun comes out and everyone is happy for a while, having fun, because there is always time for that when you are slowly being hunted down by the enemy. There are some nonsensical ideas for rescue missions, between which we learn that the Japanese counterattack everyone was hoping for won't happen, leaving them outnumbered and surrounded without any outside help. And it goes only downhill from there. Everyone has to step back before the army, who does and takes whatever they want at this point. They drink from the well first, while the students and civilians have to wait, showing how the Okinawans are less important than the mainlanders for whose sake the battle is fought. Civilians and even heavily injured are forced out of the caves. Eventually, it comes to the moment when the Himeyuri are disbanded and forced to leave before the final battle. The girls then dress up in their school uniforms, which according to the testimonies by survivors, they actually had packed with them from the start because they thought they would go back to school after a few weeks of service. I can't tell if this scene was included on purpose or not, but according to some testimonies, when they surrendered to Americans, there was a Japanese soldier among them who dressed as a woman, and when they gathered in a group, he killed himself with a grenade. It may be a coincidence, but it gives me the creeps nonetheless. Now, I'm not willing to spoil the ending for you, even though it is an important part of the movie. But I hate it when people do that, and I spoiled the movie enough as it is, so just watch it yourself, please, and be prepared for anything. If you paid attention in the beginning, you already know what's going to happen anyway, so yeah. When the movie hit the cinema, it was an instant hit with the audiences, and even movie critics were satisfied. It set a new box office record for over 6 million moviegoers, and Imai received an award for Best Director. Supposedly, The audience was crying and screaming while watching the movie. It has to be mentioned that this was just a few years after the war, and everyone had lived through it and still could vividly remember their own sorrows. There was a general anti-war mood in society, and watching these poor girls lose lives in the battle kind of struck the nerve. Generally, the movie is labeled as anti-war pacifistic movie using the girls' fate to deliver the message, but some Americans consider it anti-American. This seems like kind of a stretch. You can't really make a movie about battle with America without America. Moreover, there is no reason for a non-American movie to portray US troops as some kind of benevolent saviors of the world, like some Hollywood movies like to do. Despite some scenes that could possibly induce these thoughts, like shooting at non-military targets or people running away, nothing strongly suggests that the intention was to be anti-American. It was simply a depiction of reality, and even some US veterans admitted they were so paranoid at that point that they shot first and asked questions later. I think this reading was influenced by the Cold War at the time, and the fact that Imai was a member of Japanese Communist Party also might have played a role. Imai Tadashi was born in 1912 Tokyo and studied literature at Tokyo University, from where he later dropped out. During the war, he worked for Toho Company and directed propaganda movies like Aito Chikai from 1945, which was supposed to encourage Koreans to become Tokotai pilots, and few others. After the war, he recalled making propaganda movies as the biggest mistake of his life and joined JCP, which presented itself as anti-militaristic. In 1950, he was blacklisted from Toho Company during the Red Purge and started making independent movies, and later worked with Toei Company. Most of his movies were focused on social issues, probably as a way to repent. For instance, Mata Auhimade from 1950, which dealt with love doomed by the war, and Kikuto Isamu from 1959, which focused on mixed children living on Okinawa, and many, many more. His filmography is sometimes labeled as realism without tears because it lacks overplayed emotions and the typical Japanese melodrama. I would argue that in Himeyuri no To, the melodrama is still present in some scenes, even though not as much as in other Japanese films. Movies directed by Imai were generally well received, often winning awards, despite Imai being referred to as having inconsistent style. Honestly, I think they should have just let him do what he wanted to do. On Himeyuri no To, he worked with some well-known actors like Okada Eiji, who appeared also in before-mentioned Mata Auhimade and in famous Sunna no Onna. The character of female teacher Miyagi was played by Tsushima Keiko, who starred in Kurosawa's Seven Samurai or Kinoshita Keisuke's Umi no Hanabi. Along with them on the screen appeared Fujita Susumu as Dr. Oka and Kagawa Kyoko as one of the girls, Uehara Fumi. Both of them starred in Kurosawa's movies, and notably Kagawa starred in Tokyo Monogatari by Yasujiro Ozu. That said, Imai had available some great actors giving the movie a certain charm. Since Himeyuri no To was a great success and public adopted Himeyuri as a symbol for a few things I'm gonna talk about in a moment, remakes and other Himeyuri movies followed. Imai himself made a remake of the movie in 1982, this time shot on location and in color. I couldn't get my hands on the copy of the movie, so I'm not really sure how much different it is, but supposedly it lacks the atmosphere of the original. Charts, maps, and narrator are added for younger viewers that didn't live through the war, and the important message about Okinawa's subordination was removed from the movie. Due to this, it wasn't as successful as the original. Through the years, Himeyuri have become a symbol for anti-war movement since their lives tragically ended in the war, for feminism as some sort of woman power, for Okinawa suffering, but also as a symbol of anti-US military bases movement, portrayal of Okinawa as a feminine member of Japanese islands that needs to be protected, just like Himeyuri needed to be protected by Japanese soldiers, for nationalists as a symbol of patriotic students and pure girls that needed to be protected, and yada yada yada. They are made to be these all-lovable heroes and victims of the war. And sure, what happened to them was horrifying. I can't even fathom what they had to go through. I mean, imagine being a teenager stuck on the war front. I don't know about you, but I would definitely die within a week. The real Himeyuri no To, a memorial tower, stands in Ihara, Itoman City with names of all those who died. Surviving Himeyuri created an alumni that in 1983 established Himeyuri Peace Museum right next to the memorial, where they try to preserve testimonies and messages of peace for next generations. They also provide scholarships for female students, and some of the survivors used to share their experiences in schools and conventions throughout Japan. However, despite their reach, they stayed apolitical, only promoting peace and not blaming anyone but the act of war for what happened at the time, retaining the image of innocent victim heroines. From time to time, they got accused of intimate relationships with the soldiers, but Himeyuri themselves strongly denied these claims and sometimes consider them acts of jealousy of members of the other corpses that don't get as much attention as them. I think the movie is a nice adaptation of what happened. I had to watch it twice to be able to understand what is actually happening, but since I wasn't a target audience, I think it is understandable. Would I recommend it? Yes, but if you haven't already read up on the timeline of the events of Battle of Okinawa, I strongly suggest you do a little bit of research beforehand. That way you can follow the plot more easily. Every scene in the movie is important for the storyline, so pay attention while watching. And my overall thoughts about the movie are 8 out of 10. Personally, I kind of missed a clear message in the movie. Despite it being promoted as anti-war and Imai being a communist and all that, there were times where I felt like it was kind of nationalistic propaganda, like when they are hailing emperor before death, talking about patriotic duties, and so on. Yet, I didn't feel like the movie was anti-American. Maybe it's just my interpretation, but that's what movies and art are for, to find something for yourself in them, with this very deep and profound message. I am going to end my video. I hope you found it at least somewhat informative. Hopefully, I didn't bore you to death, and if you made it this far, thank you. Feel free to comment any questions, suggestions, opinions, whatever you want really. I will read it, even if it is a recipe to your favorite dish. As a real YouTuber, that I definitely am if you couldn't tell so far, I will now beg for likes and subscribes. Pretty please! Maybe we will see each other again. Hopefully not though, because this was an effing roller coaster and I am traumatized. Stay safe, guys, and sayonara!